Move that junk before investors see it. Claire Bennett said it without raising her voice, and somehow that made it colder. The words sliced across the white marble entrance of Bennett Motors just as Ethan Walker stepped out of his old Chevy C10, one hand on the dented door, the other reaching back for his daughter. The truck coughed once, shuddered like an old horse asked to stand too long, then went quiet beneath the glass tower that rose 40 stories above downtown Detroit. Every polished window reflected what Claire saw. Rust along the fenders, primer patches on the hood, a cracked windshield, and a thin black drop of oil falling on a stone that probably cost more per square foot than Ethan made in a week. Abby Walker climbed down carefully from the passenger side, clutching her backpack to her chest. She was 10, small for her age, with pale blonde hair tucked behind one ear and the cautious eyes of a child who had learned to read rooms before entering them. "Daddy," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" Ethan looked at the oil stain, then at the line of executives standing near the entrance with coffee cups, tablets, and practiced smiles waiting for the investor convoy. He took a folded rag from his back pocket and knelt. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We just made an entrance." A few people laughed. Not loud at first, just enough to make Abby's shoulders pull inward. The morning air smelled like rain on concrete, hot engine metal, and expensive perfume drifting from the lobby doors. Inside, a massive silver emblem spun slowly behind the reception desk, catching the light as if the building itself wanted to remind every visitor who owned the room. Claire Bennett stepped closer in ivory heels sharp enough to echo. 34 years old, tailored suit, perfect posture, the kind of confidence that came from inheriting a name everyone else had to earn permission to speak. "This is a private corporate entrance," she said. Ethan kept wiping the oil. "I understand. Then why are you here?" "To see Richard Bennett." That made the laughter sharper. A young marketing director covered his mouth, pretending not to enjoy it. One of the security guards shifted near the curb. Claire tilted her head, studying Ethan's faded work jacket, the grease under his fingernails, the tired lines around his eyes. "My father doesn't take walk-ins from mechanics with broken-down museum pieces." Abby looked up at her father, waiting for him to defend himself. Ethan only stood, folded the rag once, and held a small weathered tin box against his chest. There was no anger in his face, only something older and quieter, the kind of dignity people mistake for weakness because it does not perform for them. "I'm not here for your money," he said. Claire's smile thinned. "Good. Because judging by that truck, you'd ask for more than we could responsibly give." The crowd chuckled again. Ethan glanced at Abby, then gently placed his hand on her shoulder. He could have answered. He could have raised his voice. He could have told them the truck had crossed deserts, winters, layoffs, hospital nights, and one promise he had never broken. Instead, he looked at the tower, at the emblem turning in the lobby light, and said only, "I brought something your father asked me to keep safe." For the first time, the old security guard by the curb stopped smiling. Frank Hollis had worked the front curb of Bennett Motors long enough to know when a man was pretending and when a man was carrying history. He had seen salesmen arrive in borrowed suits, inventors arrive with wild dreams, and angry former employees arrive with envelopes full of complaints. Ethan Walker looked like none of them. He stood too still. He held that tin box too carefully. And when he said Richard Bennett had asked him to keep something safe, Frank felt an old memory stir somewhere behind his ribs, faint as a song heard through a closed door. Claire did not notice him. Her eyes stayed on Ethan, cool and dismissive. "My father is recovering at home," she said. "He is not available for sentimental visits." Ethan looked at the glass doors, then back at her. "Then I can leave it with you." He stepped forward and placed the weathered tin box on the edge of the reception counter, just inside the entrance. It looked painfully out of place beneath the chandelier lights, its corners dented, its surface scratched, a strip of faded blue tape still clinging to the lid. Abby watched the box as if it were something living. Claire did not touch it. "What is that supposed to be?" she asked. "Something that belongs to your family," Ethan said, "and something that does not." Malcolm Pierce arrived from the lobby at that moment, moving with the smooth impatience of a man who believed every room should rearrange itself around him. He wore a charcoal suit, silver cuff links, and the tight smile of corporate damage control. "Claire," he said quietly, though everyone heard him, "the investors are 6 minutes out. Why is there a tow yard situation at our front door?" A few employees laughed again, louder this time because Malcolm had given them permission. Claire crossed her arms. Mr. Walker says he knows my father. Malcolm looked Ethan up and down, and his smile settled into something smaller. Does he? Ethan met his eyes. Just once. Malcolm's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened around the leather folder in his hand. It was barely visible. Frank saw it. Ethan saw it too. I am only here to leave the box, Ethan said. Then I will go. That would be best, Malcolm replied. This company has protocols. People cannot simply drive in off the street with family stories and oil leaks. Abby's face reddened. She looked at the dark stain on the marble as if she had made it herself. Ethan noticed and shifted slightly in front of her, not to hide her from the world, but to remind the world she was not alone. Claire saw the movement, and for half a second, something almost human crossed her face. Then the lobby doors opened wider, and the cold air of business returned. Security, she said. Have the truck moved to the service lot. Quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. I can move it myself once it cools down. Malcolm gave a soft laugh. I am sure you can. But we are not running a roadside garage. Frank stepped forward before he could stop himself. Miss Bennett, he said, maybe we should let him take it himself. Claire turned toward him, surprised that the oldest guard on staff had spoken at all. Frank, is there a problem? Frank glanced at Ethan, then at the truck, then at the faded tin box under the lobby lights. No, ma'am, he said, though his throat had gone dry. I just think some things ought to be handled with care. Malcolm's eyes sharpened. It is a truck, Frank. Ethan slowly picked up Abby's backpack from the curb. Come on, sweetheart. Abby did not move right away. She looked at Claire with the kind of honest confusion adults spend years learning how to ignore. My dad fixes things, she said softly. He does not ruin them. The laughter stopped. Not because Abby had spoken loudly, but because she had not. Her little voice landed in the space between polished shoes and marble floors, and for one brief moment, no one knew where to look. Claire's mouth opened, then closed again. Ethan placed a gentle hand on Abby's shoulder. That is enough, baby. He turned toward the truck just as the tow cart rolled up from the side entrance, its yellow lights blinking against the chrome and glass. The driver jumped out, uncertain, looking from Claire to Ethan as if hoping someone would change their mind. No one did. Ethan reached for the Chevy's door handle, but Malcolm stepped closer and lowered his voice. Whatever you think you brought here, Mr. Walker, leave it and walk away. Richard Bennett has enough ghosts. Ethan paused with his hand on the rusted door. Rain began to fall in tiny, scattered drops, tapping the hood, the sidewalk, the lid of the tin box still sitting behind the glass. He looked at Malcolm, not angry, not afraid, only tired in a way that made Frank suddenly ashamed of every year he had stayed silent without knowing why. Ghosts only stay ghosts, Ethan said quietly, when living men keep lying about them. Then he helped Abby into the passenger seat. While inside the lobby, Claire Bennett stared at the unopened box for the first time as if it might contain something heavier than metal. The tow cart beeped twice, a small mechanical sound that seemed too cheerful for the shame settling over the curb. Ethan stood beside the Chevy while the driver hooked the front axle with careful hands, embarrassed by the audience behind the glass. Abby sat in the passenger seat, her backpack hugged to her chest, watching rain gather on the windshield in thin silver trails. She had seen her father lose jobs, skip meals, and smile through bills that made his hands tremble when he thought she was not looking. But she had never seen strangers laugh at him like he was something left on the side of the road. That hurt in a different place. Daddy, she said through the open window, why did you let her talk to you like that? Ethan rested one hand on the roof of the truck. The metal was cold under his palm, rough where years of weather had worn through the paint. Because not every insult deserves the gift of my anger. Abby looked down, trying to understand words that felt too grown for her heart. The tow driver tightened the chain. The Chevy lurched slightly, and a small flake of faded blue paint loosened near the lower edge of the passenger door. Abby noticed something beneath it, a line of lettering, old and pale, almost hidden under rust and primer. She leaned closer. Daddy, she whispered, what does this say? Ethan followed her gaze, and for the first time that morning, his face changed. Not much, just enough. The kind of change a man shows when a locked room inside him has been touched by light. Beneath the peeling paint, barely visible, were the words Bennett and Walker Experimental Number 1, stamped into a metal plate no bigger than a postcard. Abby traced the air above it without touching. "Walker," she said. "That is our name." Ethan gently closed the passenger door before the rain could blow in. "It is," he said. "Why is our name on their company truck?" He did not answer right away. Across the glass wall, Claire stood in the lobby beside Malcolm Pierce, pretending to review something on a tablet, though her eyes kept drifting toward the curb. Frank Hollis remained near the entrance, his cap pulled low, his face tight with memories he had not yet given himself permission to believe. The tow driver cleared his throat. "Mister, I can set it down in the service lot. I will be careful." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Then he walked beside the truck as it rolled slowly away from the front entrance, refusing to let it be dragged like trash. Abby watched him through the wet window, and something inside her steadied. Her father did not walk like a man defeated. He walked like a man escorting something sacred through a crowd that did not know how to bow. Inside the lobby, Claire finally looked at the tin box again. The faded tape on the lid had begun to loosen from the damp air carried in each time the doors opened. Malcolm noticed her staring and stepped between her and the counter. "Claire, the investors are arriving." "What did he mean?" she asked quietly. "When he said some things belonged to my family and some things did not." Malcolm smiled, but it was too quick. People who want attention learn to speak in riddles. Claire glanced toward Frank. "You recognized him?" Frank swallowed. "I am not sure. That was not my question." The old guard looked past her, through the glass, toward the truck disappearing around the side of the building. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Some names do not leave a place just because somebody stops saying them." Claire went still. Before she could ask more, 3 black investor cars pulled up to the curb, tires hissing over the rain-slick stone. The doors opened, umbrellas snapped wide, and the performance of power resumed. Smiles returned. Hands extended. Cameras lifted. But Claire Bennett, standing beneath the spinning silver emblem of her father's company, suddenly felt the weight of an unopened tin box behind her, and for the first time in years, the lobby did not feel like something she owned. It felt like something waiting to testify. The investor procession moved through the lobby like a polished parade, all dark umbrellas, leather briefcases, and careful laughter, while the tin box remained on the reception counter like a stain no one could wipe away. Claire Bennett walked at the center of it all, smiling at the right moments, speaking in numbers, timelines, market share, future growth. But her eyes kept drifting back to that dented little box with faded blue tape. Malcolm noticed every glance. He waited until the investors stepped toward the showroom, where champagne flutes sparkled beneath soft white lights, and a covered prototype waited under a silver sheet. Then he leaned close to the receptionist and murmured, "Get that thing out of sight." The young woman nodded quickly. She picked up the box with 2 fingers, as if it might leave grease on her hands, and carried it toward the rear service hall. Frank Hollis saw her go. He did not move at first. A man his age learned to survive by staying still, by letting powerful people pass, by swallowing the questions that could cost him his job. But something about the way Ethan had looked at that old truck would not leave him. Something about the name Walker had reached back 30 years and tapped him on the shoulder. In the service lot, rain fell harder now, drumming against rows of company vehicles no one had ever loved. Ethan stood beside the Chevy while the tow driver lowered it gently near a maintenance bay. Abby climbed out, her sneakers splashing in a shallow puddle. "Is this where they put broken things?" she asked. Ethan looked at the shining fleet around them, then at his rusted truck, still standing with stubborn grace. "Sometimes," he said, "and sometimes it is where they hide things that still matter." Abby studied him. "Did you work here before?" The question was simple. That made it harder. Ethan wiped rain from the metal plate on the door with his thumb, then pulled his hand away like the past was hot. "A long time ago, before it looked like this." "With Mr. Bennett?" Ethan looked toward the tower. Through the rain, the building shimmered like a promise that had forgotten who made it. "With a friend," he said quietly. Inside, the receptionist opened a storage room near the loading dock, where old banners, cracked display stands, and broken office chairs had been pushed into dusty corners. She set the tin box on a shelf beside discarded awards from past marketing campaigns and walked away without looking back. A minute later, Frank entered. The room smelled of cardboard, floor cleaner, and damp concrete. He closed the door gently behind him, as if entering a chapel instead of a closet. His hand trembled when he lifted the box. On the underside, scratched into the metal with a sharp tool, were 3 small words. For Richard, always. Frank breathed in sharply. He should have put it back. He should have called Claire. He should have pretended age had made his memory unreliable. Instead, he slid the latch open. Inside lay a stack of yellowing papers tied with twine, a black and white photograph curled at the edges, and an old drafting pencil worn almost to nothing. Frank picked up the photograph first. 2 young men stood in front of a small brick garage, sleeves rolled, faces tired, smiling like they had just built the future with their bare hands. One was Richard Bennett, younger than Claire was now. The other was Ethan Walker, standing beside the same Chevy, one hand on the hood, the other holding a cardboard sign with a name Frank had not heard spoken in decades. Frank's knees weakened, and he sat down on an overturned crate. Outside the storage room, footsteps approached fast. Malcolm's voice cut through the hallway, low and sharp. "Find Hollis, and make sure that box does not reach Claire." Frank froze with the photograph in his hand, while somewhere beyond the wall, the applause from the showroom rose bright and empty. Frank slipped the photograph into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket just as the storage room door opened. A junior assistant stood there, breathless, cheeks flushed from running. "Mr. Hollis, Mr. Pierce is looking for you." Frank kept his hand on the tin box, steadying it against the shelf. "I was checking the loading door." The assistant glanced at the box, then at the old guard, too young to understand why an old photograph could make a man look like he had seen a prayer answered and a crime remembered at the same time. He said it was urgent. Frank nodded and stepped out, leaving the box behind, but not the truth. In the showroom, Claire Bennett stood before a crescent of investors, speaking about innovation with a voice smooth enough to hide almost anything. The silver sheet still covered the new electric sedan behind her, its shape sleek and low under the lights. Cameras hovered. Reporters whispered. Executives smiled with the calm hunger of people who could smell billions before the contract was signed. Yet every few seconds, Claire felt her mind drift away from battery range, production capacity, and market disruption. She saw Ethan Walker kneeling on marble, wiping oil with his own rag, while strangers laughed. She heard his daughter say, "My dad fixes things." She heard Frank say some names do not leave a place just because somebody stopped saying them. When the presentation paused for a private investor briefing, Malcolm guided Claire into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the service lot. From there, she could see the old Chevy sitting in the rain, small and stubborn among the polished company vehicles. Ethan stood beside it with Abby, speaking quietly to the tow driver. He looked poor from that distance. He looked ordinary, but there was something about him that refused to become small. "Claire," Malcolm said, closing the door behind them. "You need to let me handle this." She turned. "Handle what?" "Walker." The name landed harder than she expected. "So you do know him." Malcolm's face softened into practiced concern. "I know enough. Your father knew many people in the early years. Some were helpful. Some were unstable. Some believed their contribution was larger than it was." Claire looked back at the truck. "He said he brought something my father asked him to keep safe." That is exactly the kind of sentence men use when they want access to money. He refused money. Malcolm's smile faded. For now, the rain thickened against the glass, turning the service lot into a blur of gray lines and reflected lights. Claire folded her arms, but the gesture felt less like authority now and more like defense. Why was his name on that truck? Malcolm went still for half a breath. Then he laughed softly. "Old prototype labeling. Contractors, vendors, mechanics. You know how messy startups are." "No," Claire said quietly. "I know how clean our company history is. Too clean." Across town, in a quiet brick home near Lake St. Clair, Richard Bennett sat in a wide chair by the window with a blanket over his knees and a nurse arranging medication on a tray beside him. The television was muted, showing live coverage of Bennett Motors Investor Day. Richard watched his daughter appear on screen, beautiful, composed, untouchable. Pride and sorrow moved through his eyes at the same time. Then the nurse's phone buzzed on the side table with a message from Frank Hollis. She glanced down, unsure whether to disturb him, but Richard had already seen the name on the screen. Ethan Walker was here. The old man's hand began to tremble. The nurse leaned forward. "Mr. Bennett, are you all right?" Richard reached for the notepad beside him, his fingers stiff, his breath uneven, His eyes locked on the words as if 30 years had stepped into the room, wearing a wet work jacket. He dragged the pen across the paper once, hard enough to tear the top sheet. Find him. The words "find him" sat on Richard Bennett's torn notepad like a commandment written too late. The nurse picked up the paper, then looked at the old man's face and understood that this was not confusion, not another drifting memory from a tired mind. This was urgency. This was regret with a pulse. She called Claire's private office first, but the line rolled to an assistant buried somewhere inside Investor Day chaos. She called again. No answer. Richard struck the arm of his chair once with two weak fingers, not hard enough to frighten anyone, but hard enough to say time was not on their side. Back at Bennett Motors, Claire stood in the glass conference room, while Malcolm Pierce filled the silence with polished explanations. "You are tired," he said. "Your father's health is weighing on you. A stranger shows up, says a few mysterious things, and suddenly you are questioning 30 years of verified history." Claire looked at him. Verified by whom? Malcolm's eyes cooled. By the people who kept this company alive. Before Claire could answer, the conference room door opened, and the chief engineer, Dana Lowell, stepped inside with a face drained of color. "We have a problem." Malcolm turned sharply. "Not now." Dana did not move. "The thermal regulation system is spiking during the final pre-launch cycle. The prototype is reading safe on the public dashboard, but internally the battery pack is running nearly 20 degrees hotter than it should." Claire's posture changed at once. The questions about Ethan, the truck, the tin box, all of it moved to the edge of her mind, but did not disappear. "Can you stabilize it?" Dana hesitated. "We are trying." Malcolm stepped between them. "Then try faster. We unveil in 30 minutes. Dana lowered her voice. "If we run a live demonstration and the system faults in front of investors, it will not just embarrass us. It will destroy the contract." The hum of the building seemed to deepen around them, fluorescent lights, rain on glass, distant applause from people who had no idea the future was overheating behind a silver curtain. Claire walked quickly toward the engineering bay, Malcolm beside her, already speaking into his phone, already turning risk into language, language into cover. In the service lot below, Ethan had the Chevy's hood up, not because the truck needed much, but because old machines calmed him. Abby sat on the edge of a loading dock with a paper cup of water a kind mechanic had given her. "Are we leaving soon?" she asked. Ethan tightened a loose clamp with a small wrench. "Soon." Then the side doors opened, and two engineers rushed past carrying diagnostic tablets, their voices low and worried. Ethan did not mean to listen. He had spent too many years teaching himself not to step into rooms where he was not wanted. But then one phrase caught him: thermal runaway in the secondary loop, followed by another, same failure pattern as the early bench model. His hand stopped on the wrench. Across the bay, through a half-open door, a large monitor showed a schematic glowing in red and blue. Ethan stared at it for only a moment, but in that moment his face lost 30 years. He was no longer a tired father in a wet jacket beside a rusted truck. He was a young man in a brick garage again, hearing Richard laugh over a problem they had nearly solved before sunrise. Abby noticed the change. "Daddy." Ethan blinked, then lowered the hood halfway. "Stay here, sweetheart." Inside the engineering bay, Claire stood before a wall of data while Dana explained the fault for the third time. Malcolm kept saying delay was impossible. Claire kept asking for options no one could give her. Then, from the doorway, a quiet voice said, "Your coolant path is not failing. Your sensor priority is." Everyone turned. Ethan stood just outside the bay, rain still darkening his jacket, grease on his hands, dignity in his eyes. Malcolm's face hardened. "Get him out of here." But Claire did not move. She looked at Ethan, then at the red warning lines crawling across the monitor, and for the first time that day, her voice carried more doubt than pride. "How would you know that?" For a moment, no one in the engineering bay breathed loudly enough to be heard. Ethan Walker stood in the doorway with rainwater dripping from the hem of his jacket, looking so out of place beneath the white laboratory lights that a few younger engineers almost smiled. Then they looked at his eyes. There was no guessing in them. No panic. No hunger to impress. Just recognition, quiet and immediate, as if the glowing schematic on the wall was not a crisis but an old wound he had seen before. Malcolm stepped forward. "Claire, this is absurd." He heard two words in a hallway, and now he is pretending to be an engineer. Ethan did not look at Malcolm. His attention stayed on the data stream pulsing across the main display. Your secondary loop is doing what it was designed to do, he said. The problem is the system thinks the auxiliary sensor is telling the truth faster than the primary sensor can correct it. Dana Lowell frowned, offended despite herself. That architecture passed 6 rounds of validation. On a bench, Ethan said gently. Not under showroom load with a sealed thermal compartment and a promotional lighting rig adding heat from 12 feet away. The room changed. Not dramatically, not with applause. Just a slight shifting of shoulders, a soft turn of heads. The silence of experts hearing something they did not want to admit made sense. Claire watched him carefully. You are saying the vehicle is not overheating. I am saying it is being lied to by its own nervous system. Malcolm laughed once, sharp and humorless. Listen to him. He talks in metaphors because he has no credentials. Ethan finally turned to him. Credentials do not cool a battery, Mr. Pierce. Dana hid a small reaction behind her hand. Claire saw it. She also saw Malcolm's face tighten again at the name Walker, as if the man in the work jacket was not merely inconvenient, but dangerous. Beyond the glass, investors were gathering near the showroom stage, sipping coffee, smiling beneath suspended lights, unaware that the billion-dollar future they had come to bless was paused by a man they had watched be humiliated beside a rusted truck. Claire looked toward the monitor, then back at Ethan. Pride told her to send him away. Fear told her to cover the failure. But something deeper, something she had not expected to feel that morning, told her that truth sometimes arrives wearing the clothes you were taught to dismiss. What do you need? She asked. Malcolm snapped, Claire. She raised one hand without looking at him. Ethan stepped inside the bay. A pencil, a clean copy of the sensor map, 1 voltage meter, and 12 minutes without anybody trying to save face. No one moved until Claire said, Give him what he asked for. Dana handed him the pencil herself. Ethan leaned over the workstation, his wet sleeve brushing the edge of a keyboard, and began marking the diagram with small, certain strokes. He did not type fast. He did not perform brilliance. He simply crossed out one priority path, circled another, and drew a bypass line so cleanly that Dana stopped breathing for half a second. That routing is not in our current documentation, she whispered. Ethan kept writing. It would not be. Malcolm's voice dropped. You need to leave that alone. Ethan paused, pencil hovering over the page. For the first time, anger nearly showed in him. Not loud anger, not reckless anger, but the restrained grief of a man hearing someone guard a locked door that should never have been locked. I left it alone for 30 years, he said. Your car has about 8 minutes. Claire's eyes moved from Ethan to Malcolm, then to the schematic. A low warning tone sounded from the prototype behind the glass partition, steady and soft, like a heartbeat losing patience. Dana took the marked sheet, followed Ethan's line with her finger, and her face went pale for an entirely different reason. He is right, she said. Dana's words fell into the engineering bay with the force of a bell no one wanted to hear. He is right. The warning tone continued behind the glass, soft but steady, while every engineer in the room turned toward Ethan Walker as if seeing him for the first time. He did not smile. He did not claim victory. He simply rolled up his sleeve, stepped beside the workstation, and guided Dana through the correction with a calm that made the crisis feel almost ashamed of itself. Reroute the priority check here, he said. Drop the auxiliary sensor below the thermal governor. Let the primary loop breathe before the system panics. Dana nodded, typing quickly. Claire stood a few feet away, watching grease-stained hands point across a billion-dollar schematic with the precision of a surgeon and the humility of a janitor sweeping after closing time. In the showroom, the investors began to applaud something Malcolm had said on stage, buying him time, buying the company a few more polished minutes. But inside the bay, polish meant nothing. Only truth did. The warning tone stopped. The red lines on the monitor softened to amber, then slowly cooled toward green. A young engineer whispered. How did he know the original architecture? Malcolm turned on him. Enough. The word was sharp enough to make the room shrink. Ethan looked toward the prototype, then toward Claire. You can unveil it, but do not run the full acceleration demo under those lights until your team confirms the patch. Dana nodded at once. That is the safest call. Claire's eyes stayed on Ethan. You said you left it alone for 30 years. Malcolm stepped in before Ethan could answer. He is emotional. He is trying to attach himself to this company at a vulnerable moment. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. That silence, somehow, made Malcolm look smaller. Then the door opened, and Frank Hollis entered with rain on his cap and fear in his face. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you need to see something before you go back on that stage." Malcolm moved toward him. "Frank, not now." Frank held his ground. For 30 years, he had opened doors for people richer than him, nodded at men who never remembered his name, and stood beside glass walls watching other people tell clean stories about messy beginnings. But there are moments when a quiet man must decide whether his silence is peace or permission. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out the old photograph. Claire took it slowly. The edges were curled, the surface faded, but the image was clear enough. Her father stood young and smiling beside a brick garage. Beside him stood Ethan Walker, younger too, one hand resting on the same rusted Chevy now hidden in the service lot. Between them was a cardboard sign marked with a company name Claire had never seen in any official archive. Her breath caught. "Where did you get this?" Frank looked toward Malcolm. "From the box he told you to hide." Malcolm's face went pale beneath the showroom lights spilling through the glass. Before anyone could speak, Claire's phone rang. The screen showed her father's house. She answered with trembling fingers. The nurse's voice came through, tight and urgent. "Miss Bennett, your father is asking for Ethan Walker. He wrote the name himself. He is insisting you bring him now." Claire lowered the phone slowly. Beyond the wall, the announcer called her name, summoning her back to the stage, back to the cameras, back to the spotless version of history. She looked at Ethan, then at the photograph, then at Malcolm, whose silence had finally begun to sound like guilt. Claire Bennett did not return to the stage with the same face she had worn that morning. She walked slower now, carrying the old photograph in one hand and her phone in the other, while Ethan Walker followed several steps behind with Abby at his side. Malcolm Pierce tried to intercept her near the curtain, whispering about investor confidence, legal exposure, timing, reputation, but Claire kept walking. For the first time in her life, the company name above her did not feel like a crown. It felt like a question. The showroom lights brightened, and the applause began before anyone understood what was happening. Reporters lifted cameras. Investors straightened their jackets. The silver-covered prototype waited at center stage like the future itself was holding its breath. Claire stood at the microphone, looked out at the room, and saw the same people who had laughed at Ethan beside his truck. Then she looked down at Abby, whose small hand was wrapped around her father's. "This morning," Claire said, her voice steady but softer than anyone expected, "I made a mistake. I judged a man by the rust on his truck instead of the truth in his hands." The room went quiet. Malcolm's face tightened near the edge of the stage. Claire lifted the photograph. "For years, I believed Bennett Motors began with one man. My father. Today, I learned that our beginning was more honest than that, and more painful." The screen behind her changed from the polished investor presentation to the old photograph Frank had carried out of the storage room. Richard Bennett and Ethan Walker appeared 20 feet tall, young, tired, smiling in front of a brick garage and a rusted Chevy. A sound moved through the crowd, not a gasp exactly, but the soft collapse of certainty. Then the side doors opened, and Richard Bennett was wheeled into the showroom by his nurse, a blanket over his knees, a folded paper in his trembling hand. Claire stepped down at once, tears already bright in her eyes. Richard did not look at the investors. He looked only at Ethan. The old man raised the paper. On it, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Ethan Walker built this company with me." Ethan stood still as the room absorbed what pride had hidden and fear had buried. Malcolm tried to speak, but no one turned toward him. The silence had already chosen who it believed. Richard reached for Ethan's hand, and Ethan took it without ceremony, without triumph, without making the old man pay for every lost year in front of strangers. "I am sorry," Richard whispered, barely loud enough for the microphone to catch. Ethan lowered his head. "I know." Claire turned to the room. "Effective immediately, the founding record will be corrected. Ethan Walker's name will be restored. The archive will be opened. And the scholarship fund for working-class engineers will begin today in honor of every quiet hand that helped build what others inherited." No one clapped at first. They were too still. Then Frank Hollis, standing near the back in his rain-darkened security jacket, brought his hands together once. Dana followed. then the engineers, then the investors. Soon the applause filled the showroom, but Ethan did not look lifted by it. He looked relieved, as if a heavy door inside him had finally opened and let his daughter see the room beyond it. Abby tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "does this mean they know now?" Ethan looked at the photograph, then at the old Chevy visible through the glass wall of the service lot, wet with rain and stubborn as Grace. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, "but we knew before they did." Months later, the Chevy C10 stood in the Bennett Motors atrium, not polished into something false, not stripped of every scar, but restored with respect. Beneath it, a bronze plaque read, "Respect the hands that built what you inherited." Ethan did not become a man hungry for cameras. He became an advisor, a mentor, a father who still packed Abby's lunch every morning and still wiped his own tools clean at night. Claire learned to listen before judging, to ask before assuming, and to bow her head when dignity entered the room wearing work boots. Because sometimes justice does not arrive shouting. Sometimes it arrives in an old truck, carrying a tin box, a tired father, and a truth patient enough to wait 30 years. And if this story left you thinking of someone whose quiet work was never fully seen, share their name in the comments, carry their dignity forward, and stay with us for more stories about grace, second chances, and the kind of respect that can heal a room.